tell you a story about a friend of mine. We were roommates, our play bureau at the Naval Academy, and afterwards, our ways sort of parted. But nonetheless, his name was Bob Graustein. And Bob went on to become a very experienced naval aviator. And on December 21st, in the year 1972, Bob led a flight of A-6 attack planes from the carrier Saratoga. And they were targeting an airfield near in North Vietnam. And Bob didn't make it. And his remains were not returned to the United States until 1984, and he was officially buried in 1985. He left behind 3 children, the oldest of which was 10. And on that December 21st, which incidentally was just a few days before the end of the Christmas bombing, which if you read about Vietnam, you'll read about that, and only about a month before American involvement in the war ended. And it gave me a great deal of pause thinking about this, because that was my first year at Camden County College, and it was a happy Christmas for us. We had a new baby, and I think about Bob, and I think about all those years that he missed. But like other friends of mine who served there, and some others who died there, it's an important topic for me. Anyway, we're very, very fortunate tonight. We have as our speaker John Olson. Now, John is different from our usual speakers, who you know are academics. John was, who incidentally was born in Evanston, Illinois, grew up in Minnesota, and from a very early age was interested in photography. From the age of 12, he decided he was going to be a photographer. I mean, whoever decides on a career at age 12? Certainly not me. But nonetheless, he worked for UPI and then was drafted in the United States Army and assigned to the newspaper Stars and Stripes as a photographer. And he was assigned to Hue, the ancient imperial capital of Vietnam, and he was there during the Tet Offensive in the Battle of Hue. Now, John has gone on and done a lot of other things in his career as a photographer. He worked for many years for Life magazine. He, once Life closed in 1972, he set up his own companies along with his wife, and right now they manage a nationwide digital imagery business for professional photographers and others. But what's different tonight, that John was there, and John captured not only the picture images, but he also has interviews with some of the survivors that he tracked down. But before we begin tonight, I wonder, do we have any Vietnam veterans here? If they would please stand. Please stand if you're a Vietnam veteran. And do we have veterans of the Gulf War? Any veterans of the Gulf Wars? No? How about veterans, period? Please stand if you're a veteran. So whatever lessons we learned from Vietnam, the most important one is that the people who served there and the sacrifices they made are separate from any political decisions that occurred. And so all of the people who served, both there and in other areas of the military, are deserving of our not only our applause, but deserving of our support over the years. But anyway, tonight, as I said, of extraordinary talk, and it gives me great pleasure to introduce John Olson and give John a Camden County College welcome. John.
So Jack beat me to the punch. I was going to ask if there were any veterans here, if there were any Vietnam veterans here. And since that question has already been asked, I want to know if there are any veterans of any of Jack's history classes here. We got 6 survivors. Oh, more than that. Well, I want to thank Camden County College for giving me the opportunity to speak to you tonight. I want to thank you for coming. Wrong place, right time. That's what news photographers strive for. Often, the worse the place, the more opportunity there is photographically. So this is a story of a historic battle in Vietnam, the Tet Offensive, and the battle for Hue. It's primarily the story of young Marines that fought the battle. And then 50 years later, you will hear these same men tell us how that violent combat in Hue affected them then and affected them throughout the balance of their lives. This is my story about being in the wrong place at exactly the right time. I was there shortly after the Marines moved into Hue. I was there in the thick of it. You see, as a combat photographer, you can't fake it. You got to be in the middle of it. The more violent it is, the better. Undoubtedly, many of you know that the Tet Offensive and the battle for Hue eventually caused the U.S. to withdraw from Vietnam. But to the 18, 19, 20-year-old men that I photographed in February 1968, they weren't thinking anything about the historic nature of the battle. They were hanging on by their fingernails to stay alive. Now, like many Vietnam veterans, I came home and I spent 45 years not talking about it. And my story was a success story. I was a U.S. Army draftee. I went into Hue as an E4. And for all intents and purposes, 6 weeks, 8 weeks later, I became one of the youngest photographers ever hired to the staff of Life magazine. So the story I'm going to tell you tonight encompasses my story and the story of the men who fought the battle and kept me alive during my time there. So, if you'd asked me 5 years ago, did Vietnam affect you? I would have said absolutely not. No way. But as I began to research this battle, I came across an article written by the Associated Press that caused me to reevaluate my experience. You see it on screen now. It was published on February 21st, 1968. It was 3 days after I returned to Saigon from Hue. Now, when I found this article, and that's one of my photographs, at first I thought, I'd never seen this before. Well, that was impossible because I worked for the newspaper it was published in. And I read the story quickly, and the hair stood up on the back of my neck because the writer chronicled what I witnessed in Hue and what I photographed in Hue. The writer chronicled the horror to a T. But the horror he described was far more horrific than anything I saw. So I went back and I reread the article a second time, and I read it more slowly. And I learned that one person had provided all of the information about the battle, all of the eyewitness accounts to the writer, and that individual turned out to be me. I blocked it all. And that's when I realized that I and later learned that many of the Marines I went on to interview suffer from missing time. That what we saw, what in my case I photographed, was too painful for our minds to go to. Now, I know I was there, I made the photographs. But as I think about it, I always think that I came in on the end of a situation after the significant part of the horror had occurred. But I learned here that that wasn't the case. And then memories started to coming back to me. Not all by any means. And quite honestly, I'm in no hurry to learn those memories. So, start from the beginning. Here I am. Saigon, 1967. I'm standing on the doorstep of the Stars and Stripes Bureau in Saigon. Now, working for Stars and Stripes was an incredible job, and it was perfect for me because I'd been highly motivated since I was a very young man, to be a world-class photojournalist. There was one photographer, one combat photographer assigned to Stars and Stripes, me, and 6 reporters. And the 6 reporters let me go anywhere I wanted to go and do whatever I wanted to do, as long as they didn't have to come with me. Because they knew if they came with me, they'd be shot at. So I had just free rein to travel where I wanted to travel and photograph what I wanted to photograph. It was fabulous. So just a little bit about Stars and Stripes for anyone who may not be familiar with them. Stars and Stripes is the daily newspaper that's published around the world and delivered 7 days a week to U.S. troops. It dates back to the Civil War, and for decades, it's been the lifeline to the military with their home. Now, here are 2 of my photographs. One showing Stars and Stripes as it looked in 1968, and one from an operation where we captured a Viet Cong, and the U.S. Army soldier is seen reading the newspaper in the background while he waits for a helicopter to evacuate the enemy. So I began my first photography in June 1967. And this was the first operation I went on. Now, I had no experience I had experience at photography, but I had no experience at combat. And on this particular operation, they would not allow any journalist to travel on the first 5 helicopters on this air assault. We were allowed to travel in the second wave of 5. I was in the first helicopter of the second wave. So the first 5 helicopters went into the landing zone, and 3 came out. And the pilot flying right seat turned to us and said, "It's hot." Now, during this particular operation, that night, this group of soldiers, they dug in, they were set up for the night, and they were attacked. And when morning came, they had killed just under 300 enemy. Our perimeter had been penetrated, and the commander had called in air on ourselves. Now, I didn't know any better. I thought this was just another day at work. But I learned soon thereafter that I had just been part of an extraordinary event. I didn't see combat like this again until probably the Battle of Hue. So here's some other early work. This is the Battle of Kayson. Kayson was a battle that was the lead up to Hue. I was there 2 or 3 times. This is a series I made there. Now, I had no formal training at photography. It was truly a gift from God. And it's taken me decades to learn that when it comes to photojournalism, I was a natural at my craft. Now, this photograph, the top photograph's an example of that. In the Battle of Kayson, there was so much incoming artillery that it was hard to resupply the base. And they did what they called LAPES drops, low altitude parachute extraction. An aircraft like this, a C-130, would come in, they would touch the runway and take off, touch and go. And as they touched, a parachute would come out the back. The parachute was attached to a pallet of supplies, and the parachute would pull the supplies out the back. This happened all day. We saw these aircraft coming in all day. But there was something about how this aircraft looked long before I made this picture that caused me to say, you should photograph this. Well, what happened was the parachute came out the back and it disconnected from the skid, and the skid was loose in the aircraft, shifted the weight. The pilot fought with it, barely was able to take off again. The skid eventually fell out the back and killed a number of Marines. So, I'm going to fast forward to January 30th, 1968. I was in Saigon, and for all of you in the military, undoubtedly, you're familiar with this, but I was there because I was ready to leave the country on a 5-day R&R, a vacation. Everybody who had spent a year there or was about to spend a year there was entitled to a 5-day R&R. And there were a number of countries you could go to. And I was going to Hawaii. You see what was on my mind. At 2:30 a.m. that morning, the Tet Offensive broke out. Tens of thousands of enemy attacked hundreds of cities, villages, and outposts throughout Vietnam. In Saigon, where I had spent the night, the U.S. Embassy was attacked and its grounds penetrated by the Viet Cong. In the city of Hue, the North Vietnamese flag flew. All R&R flights were canceled. Now, prior to Tet, the American people had been led to believe by the generals, by the administration, that the war was nearly over, and soon the troops would be coming home. The news coverage within the next 24 hours disputed that, and soon changed public opinion.
From CBS News headquarters in New York, this is the CBS Evening News with Walter Cronkite.
Good evening from ABC News headquarters in Washington.
Now, here is NBC News correspondent Frank McGee.
The new communist campaign in Vietnam continues. There are reports that the National Liberation Front has formed a revolutionary council to run Saigon. At nearby Tan Son Nhut Air Force Base, which is also American military headquarters, sporadic sniper fire continues to be heard. At Hue,
on the north side of the Perfume River, the enemy took control of much of the Citadel, an almost impenetrable fortress built in 1802.
So, let me first say that anyone who's may have suffered from PTSD, there are a small number of images here that are graphic. They're included not because of the graphic nature of them, but because they represent part of the story and the truth of the Tet Offensive. When Tet broke out, as I mentioned, I'm in Saigon, I went out and did what I did. I began to photograph the fighting in Saigon. Near Tan Son Nhut Air Force Base at 2:30 in the morning, a truckload of MPs were changing shifts, and they'd been rocketed and were all killed in an alleyway. And I went and photographed the recovery of the men who died. Now, this is me that morning. People often ask, if I carried a weapon. I explained that if I needed one, there would be plenty lying around. That was the case this day. Now, prior to Tet, Stars and Stripes had made an arrangement with other media outlets. They could publish our photos if they gave us a credit line. As I'd always wanted to be published in Life magazine, I took my film to Stars and Stripes and then to the Time Life News Service Bureau in Saigon. At that time, I mistakenly thought that the Time Life News Bureau meant Life magazine. Once I got there, I realized it didn't, that they represented Time magazine. By the time I found out my mistake, I was too embarrassed to ask for my film back. So, by the third or fourth day of Tet, all of the R&R flights had opened up, and I left Saigon bound for Hawaii and beyond. So as a serviceman, if you took R&R in Hawaii, the idea was that your family, your girlfriend would meet you there. There was one hard and fast rule. You were not permitted to leave the island of Hawaii. So on about February 4th, I flew to Hawaii. Now, I was never very good with rules. When I landed in Hawaii, I learned that my photographs had been published in Time magazine. So on my first day of my 5-day R&R, I bought a ticket and flew to New York. Now, when I arrived in New York, I called the art department of Time. I introduced myself. I explained I'd been in Saigon when Tet broke out. I had submitted my photographs to them and would like to come up and introduce myself. They invited me up. So after I'd met the people at Time, they asked me if I'd like to meet the director of photography of Life magazine, a fellow by the name of Dick Pollard. Absolutely. So after lunch, I went and met with Dick Pollard. Dick Pollard said to me, "What do you want to do after you discharged from the Army?" And I said, "I'd like to work for Life magazine." And he said, "Well, if I were you, I'd go back to college." Now, while I hadn't heard what I'd hoped to hear, that Life would consider offering me a job, at least I had the opportunity to meet Dick Pollard. So that night, I flew to Minneapolis. I spent the night with my father. And the next morning, I flew to Hawaii. The following morning, day 5 of my R&R, I boarded my flight and flew to Saigon. Now, I was the only pale GI on the flight. So arriving in Saigon late, I went back to the Stripes Bureau and went to bed. The next day, I asked where the fighting was the heaviest and learned that Hue was where I wanted to be. The next day, I flew to Da Nang and then on to Hue. So any of you who may not be familiar with it, Saigon is in the southern part of the country. Hue is approximately 400 miles north, close to the DMZ. I went to Hue because it was said to be house-to-house fighting that was close, personal, and violent. On about February 15th, 1968, my goal was to reach the Citadel. Now, Hue is made up of the new city of Hue and the old city. It's divided by the Perfume River. The old city of Hue was known as the Citadel. Now here you can see the new city on the southern part of the image, the old city on the northern part. There's a bridge there that was blown, and you can see the walls that surround the Citadel. So the Citadel is a walled city within a city. It has 30-foot-high walls and a moat. By 3 a.m. on January 30th, 1968, Hue and the Citadel were held by the North Vietnamese. So this is an image of what the exterior walls of the Citadel look like before the Tet Offensive. This is what it looked like when I arrived. Now, Battalion Commander Bob Thompson, who you're going to hear from in a little bit, recently described seeing the Citadel for the first time. He said the Citadel during the monsoon was an eerie place. It was like going back 100 years, medieval. It was a scary place. It reminds me of the knights coming out of the castle to do combat. So the goal was to get now with the bridge blown across the Perfume River. The Marines and I assembled at the Mac V boat ramp to be transported by World War II style landing craft. We were jammed in tight onto a boat that was filled with ammunition and other ordnance, and we sat on the crates. Now, here's a map that was carried during the Battle of Hue by a Sergeant J.W. Erskine's 3rd Platoon, Charlie 1-5. It shows the Citadel, the red box above the river, and then the new city of Hue below. Now, I'm about to put an X on the screen. So that X represents the Mac V boat ramp. I'm going to put another X on the screen. And we were headed for the Arvin compound. Arvin is the Army Republic of Vietnam. On January 30th, 1968, during the initial attack, the Mac V compound was heavily hit and just hung on by their fingernails, as did the Arvin compound. So as we began our trip across the Perfume River, and just minutes from the shoreline, there was a huge, I'll call it an explosion. There was a huge noise that reverberated through the landing craft off to my right. Here you see the Marines on board reacting to that noise. A B-40 rocket, or some say a recoilless rifle round, had been fired at us. It flew, it hit our boat, but it failed to explode. It was a dud. That was our welcome to Hue. So, reaching the Citadel. This is what the Citadel looked like when I arrived. When I arrived there, the Marines had been there about a day. They were 18, 19, and some 20 years old. They were dirty, they were tired, they were wet and hungry, and they were heavily armed. And that's a combination where I felt as safe as you could feel. So this is a photograph that shows their living conditions when I arrived. And this is what they looked like. Now, even today when I interview survivors, everyone has a nickname, but their actual names really aren't all that clear. So this is a Marine they called Lurch. Now I want you to look at his eyeglass lens. Take note of this. Look at the tape holding his lens in place. We're going to hear more about this as we go on. So during my time in Hue, I photographed what I'll call 3 separate events. The courtyard is one of 3 of these. Now I'm going to read to you from the AP article that I showed you earlier that describes what I photographed. So this is my first-person testimony to the AP reporter shortly after I left the battle. Here I described what happened to us in this courtyard. Quote, "Thursday morning," Olson said, "the platoon moved forward through the narrow alleyways and tree-lined streets of a housing area to attack the tower over the east gate. They dashed at a half-crouch into a courtyard but didn't make it across. 3 communist rockets crashed into the yard. The radio operator was killed. Several other Marines were wounded. 8 men in this squad retreated to a vacant villa and fired back. A medic ran out to help the wounded and was hit in the legs and fell. A Marine scrambled into the courtyard, but an enemy sniper hit him in the neck, and he cried for help. 'We know,' a buddy shouted back from the villa, 'but we can't get to you.'" Still reading. "One of the wounded men, hit in both legs, dragged himself across the courtyard to the door of the villa, where he grabbed the end of a rifle extended to him and was pulled in. An hour later, as the battle still raged, there were 9 men in the villa and 3 were wounded. They did not know where the other units were. They were down to several hundred rounds of ammunition, and the radio was lying in the courtyard on the back of the dead radio man. The machine gunner, a lance corporal, borrowed a knife, crawled forward, cut the radio free, and crawled back. But the radio wouldn't work. The small band of leathernecks could hear the other platoons report to the company, but they couldn't transmit. But the radio wouldn't work. The small band of leathernecks could hear other platoons report to the company, but they couldn't transmit. An hour later, as the battle still raged, there were 9 men in the villa and 3 were wounded. They did not know where the other units were. A U.S. Marine wounded in hip, chest, and both legs recited the Lord's Prayer as a Navy corpsman fired bullets into the platoon's radio so the counterattacking enemies couldn't use it. The Marines ripped down drapes and mosquito netting from the villa walls to cover the man with the chest wound. He shivered from shock. "They're coming around us." On both sides, riflemen at the windows shouted as they saw North Vietnamese soldiers circling the house. One badly wounded man began to recite the Lord's Prayer. Another Marine, the one who'd been hit in the neck, tried to comfort him. "Save your ammunition until they charge," the corpsman, a Navy man, advised the Marines. Then he smashed the radio headset against the cement floor, turned the dial so the enemy soldiers couldn't trace the frequency, and fired a round into the transmitter. When the enemy didn't attack, the corpsman told the others he was going for help. He disappeared through the rear door and was back in 15 minutes to say help was on the way. A half hour later, Marines of Bravo Company arrived and laid down a veil of fire as the Marines in the villa ripped off doors to serve as stretchers and carried their wounded out. So I've been unable to locate any of the men in that courtyard series. However, this priest, named Father Aloysius McGonigal, was with the fire team that came in to rescue us. He was offering last rites to all of us wounded or not. Nearly 50 years after this photo was taken, in this audio interview with me, Battalion Commander Bob Thompson talks about Father McGonigal.
I think it was about the 10th of February. I was just turning in. Here comes this Army major, helmet, and a .45. This says, "I'm Major McGonigal, chaplain for MacV. Now I understand you don't have a chaplain, and I have permission to go with you." Of course, I was not one to question the man of God. Said, "Sure, pleased to have you." Well, the guy was a wild man. He raced around all over the battlefield, encouraging troops, get some, pulling dead and wounded off the streets, giving last rites. He came back every night and spent the night alongside me. And I got to know him pretty well. "Chaplain, you've got to back off, son. You're going to get killed." And about the 5th day, I guess it was, I don't know exactly, he went missing. So we searched for him and found him in one of the buildings. He was dead.
So shortly after I made this photograph, within, I would say, 24 hours, the story is he was captured and executed. Now here, Marine Richard Hill talks about the same priest and how that priest affected him.
There was a priest, was a Catholic priest, and I wasn't necessarily a religious young man. I was the old guy there. I was 21, and I had gotten married in a Catholic church a week and a half before I left Vietnam. So this priest would come by and give us First Holy Communion if we wanted it. He told us, he said, "I don't know if you guys, some of you will make it to Sunday." And then he come out to where we were at, and he said, "I'd like to give you guys last rites." And I asked him why. And he said, "I don't know if you're coming back." And he gave us last rites 3 times, 3 different days. It really affected me because I didn't want none of my men to die. It was tough.
So, once we were rescued from the courtyard, we moved on toward Dong Ba Tower. As we moved toward the tower, which was only a few blocks away, I photographed this sniper team that were aiming at enemy within the tower. The tower had been occupied as a high point and way, and it was causing the Marines not to be able to advance beyond that location. Now, reading from the AP article again, the platoon hadn't made it to the East Gate Tower, but other Marines had. So here we see a Marine aiming a rocket launcher at the tower, which, as I mentioned, was occupied by enemy machine guns. Prior to the beginning of Tet, Dong Ba Tower looked like this. This is what it looked like when I reached it. So this is how it looked on February 15th. Continuing to read. They blasted their way along the wall and seized the massive stone structure. But the North Vietnamese counterattacked and drove them back. The Marines attacked again and held it until 4 a.m. Friday. Then the North Vietnamese unleashed a barrage of rockets and recoilless rifle fire and charged. The enemy took the tower again, but now it was reduced to a torn finger of stone, protruding from a mountain of rubble that the Marines labeled the hill. PFC Thomas A. Zwitow disappeared as his comrades pulled back from the tower. As night fell, 7 Marines were tasked with holding the tower throughout the night. At all costs, they were told. You will hear this account shortly. Now, this is Battalion Commander Bob Thompson. Bob now is 88 years old, from Tupelo, Mississippi. He still grieves for the men he sent to their deaths. Here he describes losing his shotgun. His shotgun is his bodyguard.
I was the battalion commander of the 1st Battalion, 5th Marines. Saw about 6 Marines being hit, went down. And my shotgun, a young Marine, he's my man Friday. He's responsible for being my messenger, my bodyguard, and any way he could help me. The one I had before was killed the day before, who was like a son. Well, this new kid, good-looking young man, he grabbed me and threw me on the deck and covered my body with his. I asked him, I said, son, why'd you do that? Why'd you throw me down and cover me with your body? He said, sir, Sergeant Major told me that if something happened to you, he would have my ass. That's the way Marines are. But I said, okay, let's get out of here. He was the first man out of the room, and he was hit, killed immediately. So that wonderful young man, I really didn't get to know him, but I'll never forget him.
So this is Bob Thompson today on the left-hand side of the screen. On the right-hand side of the screen is Delta Company Commander Myron Harrington. We'll hear from Myron in a minute. So, 9 a.m., February 16th. On the left-hand side of this frame is Myron Harrington. In the middle is his radio operator, Steve Wilson. We'll hear Steve in this recording, and then we'll hear about him later. On the right-hand side is another shotgun whose identity we don't have.
The goal of every young Marine officer is to lead Marines in combat, and I felt compelled that I had to do that. We moved into the Citadel probably late on the afternoon of the 14th, and that night at our briefing, Major Thompson turned to me and he said, tomorrow Delta Company will take the Dongba Tower. He didn't say, try to, will, give it an effort or whatever. He said, tomorrow Delta Company will take the Dongba Tower. And I said, aye, aye, sir, we'll do it. Before we moved out in the attack, I went off and basically gave up my life saying, I know I'm going to make it through this. And I just asked that I not let my Marines down and that I do the best that I could do. I went into the Hue City battle with approximately 120 Marines. When we attacked the tower, we suffered 40% casualties. At the end of the battle, there were 39 of us that were still standing, made it through unscathed.
This is radio operator Steve Wilson.
Steve Wilson, who was a corporal in the Battle of Hue, was too ill to do an in-person interview about his experience there. He agreed to a telephone interview and died shortly after telling his story.
I was a 20-year-old corporal. I've been a radio operator since September. But that first night in the Citadel, Captain Harrington said, come on, Steve, we need to go down to ZP. Major Thompson wants to talk to us. He walked in the CP and me being the radio operator, I didn't have no business in that. I sat down on the steps outside. I don't know how long I was in there, probably 30 minutes to an hour. He stepped out and started back down the street toward the Perfume River. We had to go about 200 yards to where the rest of the company was. We were walking down that street, and he said, Steve, hell's coming tomorrow. He had that look in his eye. It's going to be big time. Got to be ready. I knew it was not going to be good.
This is Staff Sergeant Bob Toms. In this photo, he is directing machine gun fire from two M60 machine guns just prior to the second assault on the tower. In his audio account, he describes attacking the tower on the previous day. Now, I want you to note this helmet and the burn. And note the short sleeve shirt. The Marines didn't issue any short sleeve shirts for combat in Vietnam. This is Bob Toms today. Bob was wounded 6 times in Hue, and at that time at least, the regulation was if you were wounded 3 times, it was mandatory you be evacuated from the field of operation. He made his men swear they wouldn't turn him in. So he was wounded 6 times in Hue, and he eventually was awarded the Silver Star.
We're preparing for the night, and I'm thinking about what we need to do, the 7 of us, to survive on top of this tower. We'd already seen a couple of hundred North Vietnamese in front of us. They're going to attack us or probe us. So I have everyone check their resources. Check your pockets. What do you have? Does anybody have water? We had a little water. A couple of guys had, some crackers, and then there was a pack of Salem cigarettes. And I thought, well, we'll save those for dessert. Well, we got the first probe. I think we killed 6 or 8 guys. And there wasn't room for their bodies on the tower, so we just rolled them off the front of the tower. After each probe, I would make sure everyone was all right. I passed out some cigarettes, and we would have to cup our hands, but with this pitch dark, the North Vietnamese would fire at us. And guys were laughing. Rounds are chipping rocks away off the tower. Zing, zing, zing. And Lurch, who wore glasses, said, Sarge, I'm hit between the eyes. I said, oh my God. So I crawled over to him, and I was feeling his face. And sure enough, there's a hole right above his nose, between his eyes. And I think, oh my God. And I felt the back of his head to see if the bullet had gone through his head. I started running my finger up across his eye, and there's a rock embedded up above his eyebrow. And I was able to shove that rock down and pull it back out through the hole. And he taped his glasses back together. And he was so happy that he wasn't shot between the eyes. He was just thrilled. So we celebrated by lighting another cigarette. Even guys who didn't smoke would take a drag on a Salem cigarette. And we'd wait for the next probe.
9:30, Dong Ba Tower. Reading from the article. At 9:30, they began scrambling up the shattered wall. Now, I was the 13th man up the tower. Had I known I was about to be the 13th man, I might have changed positions, but it turned out to have been lucky that day. The man on the right here is Marine Richard Prince. We're going to hear from him shortly. Here's Richard today. One second.
The day after the tower was taken, I was shot by a sniper I was transported me to a USA station, and I know that there was a priest there. I looked up and I did see the cross on his uniform, and I knew he was the chaplain. I didn't know how much time I had. I didn't know how bad I was bleeding. And I reached over and grabbed him. I told him I believe in God. And I knew I was badly hurt. But the next time I woke up, I was being put on a chopper. I wound up on the USS Repose, a hospital ship off the coast of South Vietnam. At that point, there was a young corpsman. He took care of me like I was a baby. He brushed my teeth. He washed my body. And he took care of me for about a week. It didn't matter what color you were. This man, he knew that we was part of the same military. And he didn't hesitate to take care of me. I wish I knew his name.
It's Richard today. So at 9:30, the fire team and Bob Toms led us up the tower. He and Selwyn Tate tell their stories of the second assault. Now, you can see Bob Toms because of his ripped fatigue pants. To the right, the man whose back of his head we see is Selwyn Tate. They called him S-Man. First, here's Bob's story.
We were blown off, literally blown off the tower. Captain Harrington told me, I need you to take the tower again. I take 2 shirts off of dead NVA. The shirts are small, tiny. I couldn't even button them. Used a knife to cut the sleeves off so I could get in them. And I put my flak jacket back on. I said, can I get some grenades? He said, yeah, you can get whatever you want. I said, S-Man, go grab every grenade you can get a hold of. I wasn't specific. I meant fragmentation grenades. I meant M26s. But S-Man goes out and does literally what I tell him. Well, we start up again. And I did the same tactic on the tower that I did the day before. I can see right into the tower. So S-Man would pull the pin, pop the spoon, throw the grenade to me, and I would throw it in the tower. The first 2 or 3 were M26 fragmentation grenades, and they were great. They were blowing everything away. Then the next one he threw me was a red smoke grenade. I looked at this thing and I threw it. Then the next one he threw me was a tear gas grenade. And I threw it. Well, the North Vietnamese, with all this smoke, then there's tear gas, never running around. It's literally causing confusion, and we move right on up and just start shooting them.
Here's S-Man's story.
They sent us out on patrol, and I had this kid. It was just something about him. I was saying, I'm going to take this kid under my wing. And going towards the tree line, we heard an explosion. Eddie stepped on the mine. He wasn't quite dead. I held him in my arm. If there's anything you want, ask God. Ask God for anything you want. I'm holding and I'm praying. God, don't let him die. When he died, I lost my religion. I lost it. I got it back on top of the tower.
Selwyn Tate grew up in the Bronx. At 16, a judge offered him a choice: join the Marines or go to jail. At 05:30 on the morning of February 16, 1968, S-Man, as he was known, took communion a few hundred meters from the Dong Ba Tower.
It was cold and rainy that day. I went to Mass. And I'm saying, God, I hope I can make it out. Somebody said, saddle up. And Donnie Hammond was with me. And just before we went up on the tower, I said, Donnie, I'll see you when this is all over. He didn't make it. And Tom was buried alive. Bullets were flying right past us. It was heavy, 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 heavy fighting. All I could hear people say, I'm hit, I'm hit, I'm hit. And I kept thinking, when is a bullet gonna hit me? God was with me. We moved on up. I was using mag after mag. I kept moving up, and getting up on the top. You could see him running around the back. If they'd have gotten any closer, they'd have been hand to hand. It was hell. Everybody was getting killed that damn day. And I kept saying, when is my time? When am I going to get hit? I was 17 years old. God was with me.
This is Selwyn Tate today. Reading from the AP story. As the shooting faded away, a Marine behind a machine gun, that was Lurch, on top of a mound thought he heard a voice. He poked through the rubble and came across a hand. It belonged to Zuito. Other Marines scooped away 2 feet of bricks and dust that had buried Zuito, who was chalk white from the powdered concrete. They gave him a drink of water and bandaged his wounds. He had been hit in the legs in the 4 a.m. attack and had fallen as explosives sent a section of the tower toppling over on him. Zuito's voice was calm, but his hands shook as he drank the water and told the other Marines, "I could hear you guys plain as day. Why couldn't you hear me?" So when the 7 Marines had been hit at 4 a.m., 6 of them were blown off the tower because of the 106 round that fell short. Zuito was buried alive from 4 a.m. until about 11:30. So this is the story of Jim Walsh. Bob Toms tells Jim's story.
I get a phone call one day. He said, "Kayson, how you doing?" "Good. Who's this?" He said, "Jim Walsh. You remember me?" I said, "Of course I remember you." But how in the world are you, man? He said, "Not good. Just got home from the VA. He told me I had terminal cancer, probably about 3 months to live. Go home." Me and my family are estranged. We have nothing to do with each other. He said, "You were my platoon commander. You led me through the Battle of Way City. I want you to lead me through this." I said, "Well, what do you want me to do?" He said, "I want to go to heaven." And you probably have a picture of this guy because this is the second assault on the tower. 18-year-old, lanky California kid. And he was hit right beside me. And we're passing him hand over hand down the Dongba Tower because he'd been shot through both legs. He would call my house every other day. And we'd talk about Bible verses. My wife sent him a Bible. So I got a hold of a hospice in California. And they went out and started taking meals to him. He was getting so bad off, he could barely talk. I called out there, didn't get an answer. And I called the hospice. And they said, "Your friend passed away." They wanted to know what arrangements. They said, "Well, he didn't leave a will." So guys from Delta Company arranged for his funeral. A cemetery donated a plot, and one of the service organizations provided an honor guard. And the hospice lady told me, "I want you to know that it was very nice. The honor guard fired the salute. She was the only person at his funeral."
The next picture is the one that's best known from my series. So, in the 1980s, People magazine ran an article seeking the public's help in identifying the Marines on the tank. They said, I was told that there were over 1,000 people who identified people on the tank. Sisters, uncles, grandparents, fellow Marines. Now, as it turns out, everyone wanted to be the medic. Nobody wanted to be the guy who was shot through the chest. About 20 years ago, I was contacted by a Marine named A.B. Grantham. I've been contacted by well over 100 people who claim to be on the tank. And when I'm contacted, I ask a few questions, and most of the stories fall apart very quickly. Somebody will say, well, I'm on the tank. I say, well, describe the situation. And say, well, it wasn't February 1968, it was May 1971. And other concoctions of that. But about 20 years ago, this fellow came forward. I sent him an email. I asked him some questions, and again, the hair stood up on my neck because he described Hue vividly. So let me play you his story.
We were bed down in a house. The whole gun team was in one room, and what we think was a B-40 rocket round came through the hole and hit the back wall of that room we were in. The ceiling came down on us. I started digging myself out of the rubble, but all of the other 3 guys were wounded with shrapnel. So I started carting the wounded out, and Snow wouldn't let me take him. He told me to get the gun first because he didn't want the North Vietnamese to get a hold of the machine gun. I told him I couldn't carry him and the gun, and he said, well, take the gun. And we were getting hit pretty hard. Gunfire, grenades, it was just really loud. So I picked the gun up and I started toward the corner. And I looked to the left, and there was an NVA soldier kneeling down, aiming right at me. I was looking right down the barrel of his gun. I was standing up and was holding the M60 when I got hit in the chest. I knew I was hit bad because it burned real bad, and all I could say was I'm hit. I remember guys coming over to me and helping me. I had a sucking chest wound. I was having trouble breathing, and they took cellophane from cigarette packs and poked it into the holes so that air wouldn't come in and out, and then they put bandages over that and kept slapping me in the face and talking to me, trying to keep me awake. The battle was still raging pretty hard outside. I wasn't really paying too much attention because I really thought that I was dying. I remember them lifting me off the floor and putting me on a door that they used for a stretcher. And I remember them putting me on the tank. I could hear it running, and I could smell the diesel, and it's the roughest ride I've ever had in my life. When we got back to the triage, somebody said, this one's not dead yet. And I remember thinking, that poor son of a bitch must be hit bad. I didn't know they were talking about me. After that, I remember being medevac, and I remember them putting me up on a table, stripping all of my clothes off. Then a doctor started cutting me open on the side with a knife, and that hurt really bad. And that's the last thing I remember.
Here are 2 stories of 2 men on the tank. The man with the squid in his helmet, Richard Schlegel.
We were bed down in a house. The whole gun team.
It's all right.
When I come home, I was like a lot of Marines. I just wanted to forget everything that happened over there. And I ended up drinking a lot. Doctor said, you want to live or die? He said, if you don't quit drinking, you ain't going to last 5 years. You drink, get rid of the pain. You hurt and drink to forget some of the stuff I seen, to where you won't have a dream of seeing this blowed up or seeing that blowed up. My grandkids, they live here with me, and they always want to come give me a hug at night, tell me good night. I have been asleep, and my granddaughter touched me, and I jump up and grab her. If I'm dreaming about something over there in Vietnam, I don't want to hurt one of them.
So that was actually Leon Dyes, not Richard Schlegel. So this is Army Captain and Surgeon Mayor Katz telling his story. During his year in Vietnam, he performed 451 operations. He is the surgeon that saved A.B. Grantham's life. He was located about 10 miles from Hue. And he tells a story of another surgery.
I was lucky to have, as an assistant surgeon, Jim Thomas. He was just a skinny black guy with a big fro. Great guy and great surgeon. Patient came in with a gunshot wound to the left chest. I opened his abdomen. Blood poured out, and he had a cardiac arrest. I opened into his chest, and we did open cardiac massage for 44 minutes. Jim and I took turns doing that, and while the other one was pumping the heart, we would try to stop the bleeding. And after 44 minutes, I remember saying to Jim, I think this is it. And he said, Mayor, just give it a couple more minutes. 1 minute later, the heart started again, and we finished the operation. We kept him there for 3 days because he wasn't stable enough to send out to the hospital ship. But I'm not sure what happened after that. He left alive, and he came essentially dead for 44 minutes.
So the exhibit of all these pieces is at the museum in Washington, D.C. Mayer kept a journal of his 451 surgeries. Here on the bottom, and it's on display at the museum. Here at the bottom, it says, Grantham, AB, Charlie 1-5, GSW to the chest, gunshot wound to the chest. And then there's a little scribbling underneath it. And I said to Mayer, there's not much there. What's this about? And he said, oh, this was no big deal. I said, you mean he wasn't hurt all that badly? And he said, oh, no. He said, he came to us dead. We just brought him back but he said, we did that every day. So I left Hue and returned to Saigon once I'd shot every exposure of every roll of film I had. Now I knew if I wanted to be published in Life magazine, don't go to the Time Life News Bureau. Go to the Life Magazine Bureau. That's what I did. I introduced myself to the Far East Bureau Manager, Don Mosier. I told him my story. Saigon, Hawaii, New York, Dick Pollard, Minneapolis, Hawaii, Saigon, Hue, and here I was. The rest is really history. Within a few weeks, Dick Pollard, the man who suggested I go back to college, offered me a job. And at 21, I became the youngest staff photographer ever hired by the magazine. Now, interestingly, it took me decades to realize how the events of Tet, of Hue, of me leaving after 4 days, flying to New York, having that conversation, flying back, it took me decades to realize that was unusual. Not a lot of people do that. Now, I want to talk just briefly about combat photographers. The biggest question is, why do we do this? I don't have the answer. If anybody can put it in the suggestion box, let me know, please. But I want to tell you about the individuals. So when I went to Vietnam, the way I remember it, there were about 20 of us who went out on a daily basis into combat, or looking for combat. Here are some of them. Top, Dana Stone. He was in Hue. Sean Flynn. Koichi Sawada, Pulitzer Prize winner. Kent Potter. First time he went into the field, I took him out. Henry Hewitt. from the AP, Henri was probably the best photographer in Vietnam. Japanese photographer, life photographer Larry Burroughs, and another friend, Charlie Eggleston. Shortly after I left, they were all dead. Now, this particular slide relates to, following the Tet Offensive, there was the May Offensive. That morning, I took a series of pictures I'm going to show you here in a minute. I got wounded that morning, just for all intents and purposes, a scratch, and went to the hospital, and then went back to Stars and Stripes. Now, Stars and Stripes it was a compound, had a gate, and had a bell, a doorbell. I'm back, the doorbell rings. I go out there, it's Charlie. I said, Charlie, what are you doing here? And he said, can I borrow some hand grenades? And I said, what? He said, I'm going down the street to photograph this event, but can I borrow some hand grenades? It was like he was coming over to borrow a cup of sugar. And I said, yeah, how many do you want? He said, 2, 3. I gave him 3 hand grenades. He was traveling with Roger Norham, a UPI audio reporter. Up.
For UPI audio newsman Roger Norham, 1968 in Vietnam meant his first look at death. Norham arrived in Vietnam in March. 2 months later, he and UPI photographer Charlie Eggleston were scampering from building to building, covering the fighting just outside of Saigon.
Oh, no. No! Charlie's been shot. Oh, my God! My God, he's... Charlie's been killed. Oh, my God, blood is streaming out of his nose and mouth. He's got it right in the head. Oh, Jesus.
So I had my own brushes. Yeah, you never know how many. I was on a hilltop one night. We had rockets come in. I was there with the photographer Dana Stone, who I pointed out earlier. There was from where we were sleeping on the ground, there was the company commander had his company command post set up in a 500-pound bomb crater. We ran to it, dove in, and as we dove in, there was this huge lightning bolt, blue lightning bolt that came through the hole, and it filled with smoke. Dana and I didn't get a scratch. One soldier was killed. There were 5 of us there. 1 was killed, another one had his throat slit, and the 3rd was wounded. Where we'd been sleeping, I was using my pack as a pillow, and I had my cameras in it. And when we went back, this was what was left. So, after I was just discharged from the Army, I went back to Vietnam for life. And one day we were in the DMZ. I was riding on one of 2 tanks, and some mortar rounds came in, and it wasn't a big deal. But I just felt that it was time not to do this anymore. I flew back to Saigon. I went to my bureau manager and I said, Don, I don't want to do this anymore. And the magazine was great. They brought me home, reassigned me to Washington. But soon after, while I was waiting to return to the States, I read in Stars and Stripes how one of the 2 tanks, I don't know which one, had been rocketed the following day, and everybody died in it. So I'm going to talk quickly about one other story here. These are not my photographs. This is, the photograph in the middle is by an incredible photographer, Eddie Adams. It was during the Tet Offensive, and it was General Lewan, who was executed of Viet Cong. Now, I had some history with General Lewan. About 4 to 6 months earlier, there was a rumor that some Buddhist monks were going to self-immolate, that they were going to burn themselves in protest. And the Saigon government had put a curfew over the city, and nobody could be on the streets, and we were out driving around, and we got stopped and arrested by some of Lewan's henchmen. And I had kind of a big mouth. And I said, well, you take me to your commander. And they brought me over to this little man wearing black pajamas like a Viet Cong. And he was crouched down like the peasant class did. And I said, well, who are you? And he thought about it a second, and he said, I am, as your people say, the big man. So I got polite in a hurry. They let me go. So, in the May Offensive, I'm about to be discharged. I've got just a few weeks left. The May Offensive happens. We're out driving around Saigon looking for something. I stopped at this event. Couldn't really tell what was going on. It was next to the Saigon River. Turns out, down this alleyway, there's a sniper. We worked our way down the street waiting for something to happen. And General Lewan came marching down the middle of the street with a platoon of his. And he's yelling up at the Viet Cong to surrender. There was a burst of machine gun fire. He was hit. And then I heard something that I'd never heard before, but I knew what it was. And I shouted, grenade. They threw grenades down on us. We were hit. And all of Lewan's men, except 2, turned and ran. So there was 2 of his men, myself, another person from Stars and Stripes, and this American MP that showed up from someplace. So I said, we're not going back down that alleyway. So I said, we need to take him out through the river. So we went into the river and carried him through these stilts under these houses. And I was going first, and I turned and made one exposure, which is the one on the right. You see all the water damage to the film. We broke up through a floor, came upon this dead Viet Cong, and then got him to safety. Last story, I'll tell it quickly. In 1971, I suggested that we do a story on what it was like for GIs to transition back to the United States. I went there, I selected a soldier from Midland, Michigan, and I followed him home. I followed him to rejoin his family and his girlfriend. And I photographed him as he attempted to fit back in to his society. I photographed him as he tried to fit in with the community college kids he was now in school with, who hadn't been to Vietnam, and to fit in with the veterans who were 30 years his senior, who couldn't relate to Vietnam. I photographed him as he cruised the streets, and then as he looked for work that he couldn't find. So, this is the museum in Washington. If you have the opportunity, this exhibit is up through January 6th. I'd love for you to see it. What photography has done for me has taken me everywhere. It's given me opportunities to go places and meet people I never should have had. A decade ago, I began to realize how critical images had been to me. I worked the last 10 years and developed a means by which blind people can see art and see photography. It's on display there at the museum as well. If you're interested in more information and possibly help us identify any additional people in the photographs, The website is Tet 1968. I really appreciate your time. Thank you. And anybody's got any questions, I'd love to answer them.